It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to the Sense of Self, Accessible Art and Disability Studies full day event here at the Broad. As many of you know, there'll be another evening exhibit from 5 to 8, and we'll have 2 speakers today. But this is a tremendous moment, and I want to just give a huge shout out and thank you to all the people who've been involved so far, and to all the students who are here today, and all the faculty who are here today, but particularly to say an enormous welcome and hurrah, because it's my delight and a pleasure to be introducing Georgina Kleege, whose name I may be pronouncing correctly for the first time today. Georgina joined the English department at UC Berkeley in 2013, where she teaches creative writing, courses on literary representations of disability, and disability memoir. A pioneer in literary studies, disability studies, and accessible art, she has lectured and served as a consultant to art museums across the country and internationally, including the Tate Modern, MoMA, and now the Broad. Her collection of personal essays, Sight Unseen from 1999, is a classic in the field of disability studies, including personal account of her own blindness, cultural critiques, depictions of blindness in literature, film, and language. The essays in it have become, quote unquote, required reading for students in disability studies, as well as visual culture, education, public health, psychology, philosophy, and ophthalmology. And this is true in no small part because they are also equally critically savvy as they are delightful, witty, and wry. Her Blind Rage, Letters to Helen Keller, transcends boundaries between fiction and nonfiction to reimagine the life and legacy of this particular celebrated disability icon. And Kleege's current work focuses on blindness and visual art, how blindness is represented in art, how blindness affects the lives of visual artists, and how museums can make visual art accessible to people who are blind and visually impaired. Her second book, More Than Meets the Eye, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press later this year, and I'm delighted to introduce her as she gives her talk, Blind Self-Portraits, Remaking the Image of Blindness. Couldn't be more delighted to have you here, Georgina.
Oh, good, they're drilling. All right, and I'm warning you in advance I might spill my water, but it's just water, don't be alarmed. Thank you, Natalie, for that very nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited to experience the exhibit, and I hope that the artists in the exhibit will please introduce yourselves to me and show me your work, because I'll be very interested in that. I'm coming at the idea of access to art in a slightly different way, because I believe that when we're thinking about access to art, or access to anything for people with disabilities, there's a risk in seeing that as a one-way transaction. That sometimes access is understood as an act of charity, where the cultural institution or the educational institution provides access to a marginalized group, and then the marginalized group goes back to wherever it is that they came from, and nothing else changes. So I'm going to be talking today in most of my presentation about blind and visually impaired artists, and thinking both about how they exist in visual culture, how they process and understand visual culture, and how they speak back to visual culture. So access coming from the disabled people rather than the other way around. And now I'm engaging in a little shameless self-promotion. Natalie mentioned my new book, which is called More Than Meets the Eye, What Blindness Brings to Art. I think the title sort of says things. So I'm both talking about blind artists, I'm talking about access programs in museums and arts institutions, but I'm also sort of going back to look at philosophical, psychological, political understandings of what blindness means and how those ideas inform or don't inform the practices of arts institutions. Okay, here's my disclaimers slide. In my many years of attending academic lectures, I've always enjoyed the fact that people feel a need to disclaim or explain or, correct something. There always seems to be a moment in a talk where that happens. So this is my moment, and what I'm explaining here is my use of PowerPoint. I think of PowerPoint as an assistive technology for sighted people, because if I was speaking to a room full of blind people, I could do this in the dark. I wouldn't need to show images necessarily. But I've lived among sighted people all my life. I have a pretty good understanding of their ways and values, and I understand that, particularly today, apparently, sighted people become a little anxious and unmoored if they don't have something to look at. So I'm using PowerPoint for that. For any blind and visually impaired people in the room, I will be describing my images. I won't necessarily be describing them according to the rules of audio description, because I think some of the rules of audio description need to be critiqued. But I will be telling you what work the image is doing in my argument here. Okay. I'm beginning here with Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher and theorist, and a book he wrote. It's actually an essay he wrote in the early 1990s called Memories of the Blind, Memoirs of the Blind, the Self-Portrait and Other Ruins. It's actually an essay that he wrote to accompany an exhibit that was at the Louvre of images from the, I guess, 17th, 18th, 19th century. And this is a gross oversimplification, but part of what he observes is a connection, a parallel between self-portraits on the one hand and images of blindness on the other hand. And to really simplify what he observes is that in both those types of images, there's a disconnect between the eyes and the hands, okay? So that in both examples, the eyes are looking one way and the hands are aimed in another way. And so in the exhibit and in the accompanying catalog book, he shows multiple examples of this, and it's quite compelling to see how this works. All right, so I'll show just a couple of examples. So this is a Rembrandt etching about the biblical figure Tobit and his blindness. And Tobit is dressed in sort of biblical style robes, and he's reaching to his right while his eyes are sort of turned in the other direction. He's in some kind of temple setting. Okay, so this disalignment, disconnection between eyes and hands. This is an image actually that Derrida does not talk about. It's about a century earlier. Katrina von Hemessen, the date here is 1548. And this image is generally held, I'm told, to be the earliest self-portrait featuring the artist and her easel. Okay. And these are the types of images that Derrida and I am also particularly fascinated by, because there's the easel, that is the artist's equipment, is visible. Her hands are reaching to the right to draw on the canvas, and her eyes are facing outward over her left shoulder towards the viewer. And one of the points that Derrida makes has to do with the gaze of the self-portrait, that there's a very particular type of look in the eyes. And he theorizes that this comes from the practice of artists in a pre-photographic age of creating self-portraits by using a mirror. So they would set up a mirror and have their easel or their sketch pad to hand, and then keep looking from the mirror back and forth to the canvas. Okay, and so it's a kind of virtuosic performance. There's great virtuosity in the eye-hand-brain coordination that goes into this process. And Derrida also goes on to talk about how in that back and forth process, there's a moment of blindness where the artist is not drawing what she's seeing at the moment. That she's at the same time drawing from life and drawing from memory. Okay. When I ask people, and I should have said this in my disclaimers, I'm describing images that I do not see myself. My descriptions are based on a compilation of information, my questioning of my favorite cited informants, many of whom are artists themselves. And I have a kind of sequence of Q&A that I often ask. And one of the things that somebody said about this image and some of the other self-portraits is how the artist often looks a little surprised, maybe a little startled, as if caught in the act. And I sort of like that idea. This is an image of an artist caught in the act of being an artist. Okay. This is another Rembrandt. This is an early self-portrait. I was looking at artists who created a lot of self-portraits, and Rembrandt is certainly one of those. This is an early one. Rembrandt in his studio facing a very, very large canvas. And people often say that he's sort of dwarfed by his canvas. And people make metaphors about how, this is sort of early in his career and he's sort of dwarfed or intimidated or awed by his future, what the future holds for him. But again, there's a sort of disalignment between hands and eyes there. Did that go to the next one? Is that showing Van Gogh? Okay. Oh, there we go. This is a Van Gogh self-portrait, 1888. Van Gogh also, many, many self-portraits, and here he is with a sketch pad. And I'm told that his expression, he's sort of squinting at the viewer. One of the reasons that the self-portrait is such an honored genre is it meant that artists who didn't have money to pay for a model could always have a model in themselves, so that if they just had a mirror, they would have a model. And Van Gogh certainly falls into that category. Okay, so those are some self-portraits. Now I want to look at a 20th century example of an image of blindness and see if Derrida's theory sort of connects. So this is an image called The Blind Man's Meal by Picasso. It's from his blue period. So the dominant color here, I don't know how well that's showing up in daylight, but I'll tell you, so you'll know. The dominant color here is shades of blue, a particularly somber, dark, grayish blue. Someone described it to me as being like different shades of denim, which I rather like because that also summons a kind of textural idea. And when so eyes and hands, okay, we're looking for eyes and hands and a disconnect between the directions of the eyes and hands. And when I ask my informants, one of my favorite questions to ask people when they're describing a painting to me is, where does your eye go first? Because I'm interested in the ways that artists draw the viewer's eye and direct the viewer's gaze so that they experience the work in a particular way. And all of my informants always did the same thing. It goes first to the hand. Okay, so his right hand is reaching out at a rather unusual angle. His fingers, which are quite long, proportionate to the rest of his body, reaching at a sort of 45-degree angle towards the jug that's on the table before him. And because Picasso knew what he was doing, he sort of emphasizes this effect in that the jug is the complementary, but what do you call it, the opposite color to the dominant color of blue. And so that has the effect of drawing the eye. And there's even a little white square suggesting the reflection of light off the glossy glazed surface of the jug. Okay, so the eyes go to the hand first, and then almost instinctively, people seem to then look at the eyes to try to understand the unusual gesture of the reaching hand. And the eyes are hard to read. They don't seem to be aimed at the hand. They don't seem to be aimed at his other hand that's holding something round, which is identified as a piece of bread. It doesn't seem to be that he's looking into the empty bowl that's on the table beforehand. His eyes have been described to me as being very deep set, possibly even partially closed. So his whole body is somewhat contorted. His right shoulder seems to be moving away from the hand that's extended. The tendons on his neck are sort of prominently highlighted, and so on and so forth. So the whole image, so Picasso is showing the blindness here in this gesture with the hand, with the gaze that's hard to read, but definitely not lined up with the hand. And then along with that, there's a sort of association of mournfulness and darkness, isolation, so on and so forth, sadness, that comes from the blue color and from the sort of meagerness of his surroundings. Okay, I've lost my button. Okay, here's a bit of text from Derrida that I like. It sort of summarizes what he's saying about drawings of blind men. He says, if to draw a blind man is first of all to show hands, it is in order to draw attention to what one draws with, the help of that with which one draws. The body proper, core proper, as an instrument, the drawer of the drawing, the hand of the handiwork, of the manipulations, of the maneuvers and manners, the play or work of the hand. Okay. So he's saying, in effect, that to show blindness, because blindness doesn't always show, right? It's not always apparent that a person might be blind. It doesn't always show up in the eyes or any other visible sign. So he says, if you're going to draw an image of a blind man, first you show hands. And that he's connecting this back to the idea of self-portraiture, in that the artist is showing hands to show the blindness, but also drawing attention to what he draws with, right? So the idea that the hand is also what's making the drawing of the hand. So in a way, he's saying that a portrait of a blind person is also a self-portrait. Okay. So to illustrate that, I've put the blind man's meal next to one of Picasso's self-portraits. This one does not have images of his hands. It's from about the same period. The background color, incidentally, is the same. He's using the same palette, but he's using the orangey color of the jug in the blind man's meal for the background of his self-portrait. And the point that I'm making about this self-portrait of Picasso is that the eyes are very prominent. And in fact, in photographs of Picasso and in accounts of people who knew Picasso, people always make this point about his eyes. He had these very large, dark eyes. And so we have this pairing of the blind man on one hand and the sighted artist on the other hand. And where the blind man is all hands, the sighted artist is all eyes. Okay. So this led me to wonder, well, what happens then if the artist is blind? And how do blind artists, blind and visually impaired artists, make the blindness show? The artists that I'm about to talk about are all artists who had an existing artistic practice and then lost sight, but continued their practice. And they're also artists, the reason I chose them was because they are in some sense commenting on the experience of blindness. And so I want to look at how they represent blindness and to see if, to what extent they conform to or deviate from more classical or stereotypical understandings of blindness. Is it always about loss? Or is there some element of realignment of the senses, an understanding of blindness in social interactions in social space? And in mentioning the ideas of realignment of the senses, when artists, some of these artists as we go along, are working towards to engage with the non-visual senses and thinking about how, when that happens, how does that impact how their work is displayed in museums, which are typically ocular-centric spaces. Okay. So I'm going, whoops, what did I do? I need help. Okay. Does this say Ellis Wingwall? Okay. This is I'm going to start with a series of blind photographers. I've sort of chosen artists from the various media, so some photographers, a painter, a filmmaker, a performance artist, social practice artist, and finally a sculptor. And I'm using a rather capacious understanding of self-portrait because I think it's applying here. So this, I'm calling this a self-portrait for the way that the artist brings herself and specifically her blindness into her images. So Ellis Wingwall is a photographer. She had a long practice, particularly as a historian of architecture and a photographer of architecture. And this image, Hand Over Dog, Joseph at the Temple of Dender, is part of a series that she did in the 1990s as she was losing her sight to retinitis pigmentosa. She took her service dog, this is the dog at the time, Joseph, to her favorite architectural sites around the world and made images of him. And this is an image at the Temple of Dendor that is, as you probably know, an Egyptian temple that was moved from its original location in Egypt to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and a whole wing of the museum was built to house it. Okay, and Wingwall likes this both the temple and the architectural arrangement that was created for it. So the image in the mid-ground shows the temple in the site, and there are museum visitors sort of walking to and fro in the middle ground. In the foreground, we see a yellow Labrador pictured in profile. His nose is pointing to the right of the image. And in the the nearest foreground, there's an image of the artist's hand, a little bit out of focus, pointing towards the temple. The dog, however, is looking the wrong way. Okay, so most viewers, it's sort of an eye-catching image. People ask, what is the dog doing? in a museum, and then, aha, the revelation, it's a service dog, and you can apparently see part of his harness on his shoulder. So the artist is bringing her blindness into the image by showing both her hand and her service dog. And the hand, and a lot of these images have her hand and her hand pointing, I think references medieval and early modern paintings that feature a pointing figure. You may be familiar with some of these works where often you have a large cast of characters on the canvas, and then there's somebody pointing to direct the viewer's gaze. Oh, there's Jesus Christ, or there's the thing you're supposed to be looking at. You can ignore that other stuff. Look over here. So it kind of it makes a message about what art does, how the artist organizes and directs the viewer's gaze. While it's also kind of witty, it's humorously debunking the myth that the seeing eye dog does the seeing for the blind person. Okay, the dog is not really interested he's looking out the window, in effect. Okay. Here's a more recent image by Wingwall, sunset over the Gulf of Mexico, which, as the title implies, is an image of a setting sun over a body of water. But in the foreground, again, the artist brings her hand into the image, her left hand, which is holding a pair of sunglasses, dark glasses, that have a looping ribbon, apparently to be worn around the neck. Okay. So it's sort of it's an iconic, what do you call it, touristic photograph, but it's a photograph that went wrong. You're not supposed to take the picture of the sunglasses. But at the same time, it's the glasses that are bringing the blindness into the image, that dark glasses being another attribute of blindness, like the white cane, like the service dog. And so there's maybe the possibility that she's, whipping off her sunglasses, whipping off the attribute of blindness, the lenses that would distort the colors of this natural beauty. At the same time, obviously this was a staged image. Wingwall has said that when she was a sighted photographer, she was reactive, that she waited for things to be right, and then she took her images, snapped the shutter. That as a blind photographer, she's proactive, so that she arranges her images. She knows in her mind what she wants to have happen. She arranges herself and her camera and whatever it is, her subject, and then takes the image when she believes it to be the right time. Okay. This is an artist named John Dugdale, and this is maybe a more conventional self-portrait, a kind of headshot, almost like a selfie, but not quite. So his head and some of his shoulders are visible in the image. What's striking here is the blue color. Here, this is a cyanotype, which is an older form, a 19th century photographic form. And Dugdale was interested in sort of the history of photography, so drawing attention to his media by using this earlier form, which actually is less toxic than other film developing forms. But the other thing that's striking about the image is that it's a face. He's wearing glasses, and then pushed up on his forehead are another pair of glasses. And these, I'm told, have the curvature of the lens is very pronounced, so there's a sense of magnification. His face is partially in shadow, so one of his eyes is more visible than the other, and there is reflection off of the lenses. So he seems to be gazing out at us, sort of staring back at us in a direct manner. But his gaze is also obscured, it's duplicated. There's sort of a lot going on. So he's deliberately photographing himself with the assistive technologies he used to make photographs. So he's drawing attention to that with which he makes photographs in this particular way. his expression has mystified my informants. He's described, people can tell me what they think. He's described as looking reflective, contemplative, but also a little hostile. Anyway, you can decide for yourself. This is another of the group of blind photographers, Kurt Weston, who did a series of photographs as he was losing his sight. This one, what is the title on this one? Losing the Light, yeah, okay. So he did a series called Blind Vision. And what he did was, rather than using a camera, he, like Wingwall and Dugdale, had a photographic practice. He was, in fact, a fashion photographer. And then as he lost his sight, he became more of a fine arts photographer. And this was a series of images he did using, instead of a camera, he used a flatbed scanner. Okay, so he's laying his face on the bed of the scanner. And here he has his hand visible, pressed up against the glass of the scanner as if, fending something off or breaking his fall or something. It's a black and white photograph, and the blacks are very, very pronounced, and his pale skin stands out against the black backgrounds. The glass surface of the scanner was smeared with what apparently was dishwashing soap, but there are sort of streaks going horizontally across the image, as if he sort of slid across this surface. And there's a quality of almost violence, as if his face has been smashed up against something or smeared against something. He also talked about, like Wingwall, saying that the difference in his process was that he became more proactive as a blind photographer, that he, rather than waiting for the shot to be right, he sort of knew what he wanted and then could sort of stage the image to create what he was going for. Okay. So those are the blind photographers, and just to sort of summarize, they're bringing the blindness into the image while they're also drawing attention to the photographic process. So Weston is sort of breaking the fourth wall, or drawing our attention to the fourth wall of the photograph, while Wingwall and Dugdale are sort of making prominent the assistive and prosthetic devices that they use to continue their photographic process. Okay. And now I'm going to talk about a painter, British painter named Sarge Eman. This is an image of the artist. He died in 2015. He's quite well known in Britain. I don't know that he's as well known here. He's an artist who always had vision problems. And throughout his life, he had operations, he had cataracts, he had detached retinas, he had all sorts of issues. So his vision was sort of changing all the time. And he said in one interview that he believed that he had a long apprenticeship that prepared him for the total blindness that he experienced at age 68. Okay. And this is an image showing him working, and it's showing him how he marked out a canvas. So he would mark out a canvas knowing where he wanted to apply the paint, and he would sort of have string and blue tack and different devices to sort of mark out the canvas, and then he would apply the paint later. And then this is his a self-portrait. This is the image that's on my book cover. And at first glance, many of my informants read this as a pure abstraction, but after a minute, they recognized the silhouette of his head and shoulders. His shoulders, he's wearing a blue shirt, and then the sort of central part of the silhouette is sort of in blue and black and dark colors, and then behind him are the greens and oranges and yellows. So it's as if he's backlit with a garden scene behind him. And my informants are very, very detailed about the handling of the paint. So again, the way in which he brings his blindness into the image through the handling of the paint. There's sort of you can kind of see where his glasses are on his head, but there's a lot of horizontal brush strokes there, as if was he trying to blot out or black out the image of his face. Other informants say, no, it looks more like he has a black scarf draped over his head. Okay, so there's a lot of ambiguity about what's going on here. And on the one hand, it may be, again, a sort of a depiction of loss, the loss of central acuity in his vision, or it may be a sort of more matter-of-fact, less emotional depiction of the experience of lost acuity, where shadows, where there's an erasure of detail, and where shadows acquire a greater sense of density. Okay. I'm going to mention briefly Derek Jarman's film Blue, which is an autobiographical film, and so therefore I'm putting it in the category of self-portrait. What this film is, if you haven't seen it, is a 73 or 76 minute film where on the screen there is nothing but this blue color. That silhouette there is not Jarman. I just, somebody said it was a nice looking image, so I used it. But the point is the blue, okay? So that, the screen is constantly blue. There's nothing on the screen except blueness. And the soundtrack is very, very rich. There's both a kind of the artist and friends of his actors, so on and so forth. The artist is sort of meditating on the experience of lost vision. We hear him in various scenes of daily life in a cafe, at home, in the infusion suite in the hospital where he received treatment. And that's sort of cross-cut with what seem to be excerpts from a kind of fantastical narrative featuring a blue-eyed hero named Blue. Okay. So Jarman talked about why he did this. He wanted to make an autobiographical film without images of himself and without images of anybody, for that matter. And he was doing this in protest against the proliferation of images of gay men with AIDS in the late 80s and 1990s. And he found these images troubling because on the one hand, they were sort of there to evoke pity, but on the other hand, were they sort of projecting a sort of heteronormative warning about gay lifestyle, as we used to say. Okay. So there's that going on. It's an elegiac film. Jarman knew he was dying. There's a motif that repeats throughout the film of recital of names of friends of Jarman who had died of AIDS. At the same time, there's a kind of defiant message about the tyranny of the image, that this is a visual artist who is kind of moving defiantly away from image. And where he's moving to is a different non-visual senses, particularly audition. Okay, so the film is a kind of a radio play. In fact, it was originally broadcast, simulcast on British television and on radio to give the audience the best sonic experience of the time. It's kind of like listening to a podcast, a kind of lyrical podcast, in effect. So it's a film where the soundtrack is elevated from its usual secondary status to prominence. And as such, it's a film that I like quite a bit because as a blind viewer, it's perfectly accessible to me. In fact, I would argue that it may be even more accessible than it is to many sighted viewers. I've never screened this in a theater. I'd sort of like to do it because I think today what would happen would be, in about 5 minutes in, the darkness of the theater would be pierced by the lights of smartphones as the audience who are craving images, are being deprived of images, have to satisfy that need. Okay. I'm moving here to a Canadian social practice artist, performance artist, named Carmen Pepele, and I'm going to look at a couple of his projects. So these are all public art projects. They're sort of political interventions. He's sort of out in the world doing things, and then someone is documenting, photographing, videotaping him, in particular responses of other people. And while Jarman and some of the other artists are preoccupied with loss, Jarman is sort of thinking about the heightening of other senses. Pepele is interested about the experience of blindness in social spaces. And in particular, he's interested in the experience of someone who's newly blind who feels himself conspicuous in the landscape. So he does a lot of work with his white cane. So here's one piece where he has a very, 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 very long white cane. This one I think is about 15 feet long. There are others that are, even longer, so he can stand on one side of the road and the cane can reach the other sidewalk in some instances. There are phallic implications of this, of course, which I'll let you think of yourself. Okay, this is another, so he's interested in mobility and wayfinding and these sorts of things. So here he abandons his white cane and substitutes it with a marching band. So he enlisted this marching band and they walk around and they're not coached at all. They don't have a score, but they spontaneously figure out ways to signal different things to him, like look out, there's a curb, don't bump into the tree, et cetera, et cetera. You can find a video of this, which is quite appealing, where, he and the marching band, they all get onto a bus, and then they all go into a sandwich shop, and he orders a sandwich. So it's very appealing, it's funny, and if you think back of the Picasso image of blindness, that it's mournful, solitary, here the blind man is in community, it's a parade, it's sort of joyful. The band is wearing the outfits that marching bands wear. There are kind of lookers on, passers-by who are sort of joining the parade. So it's a kind of fun and joyful image of this experience, but still highlighting this sense of conspicuousness. This is another project. This is a site-specific project called Blindfield Shuttle, where he goes to sites and then he gets participants to take a walk with him. And the way it works is he leads, he's here leading, and people behind him, they put their hand on his shoulder, and everybody puts the hand on the shoulder of the person in front of them. And then they go off, and this is a particularly long line. It's maybe a dozen or more people extending behind him in a straight line and then going off, turning the corner. They're all turning the corner. And they have their eyes closed, okay? One of the things that I like about this image is off to the right, there's a man, maybe in a security guard or something, and people have described his expression as looking dumbfounded, or there's some consternation. Anyway, he doesn't know what he's looking at. Now, on the one hand, this might seem to be something like a simulation exercise, those exercises that sometimes charities do, where you put on a blindfold and you pretend to be blind for an hour or something, and then that's supposed to create empathy. But here it's the blind man who's doing the leading. right? And that might remind you of the parable about the blind leading the blind, except that he knows what he's doing. And there are talkback sessions at the end of these things where it's less about empathy and it's more about people talk a lot about trust. People talk about wayfinding. They talk about proprioception, the sort of tactile experience of the environment around them, developing a sense of listening for oral landmarks and so on and so forth. So it's sort of less about just, I feel sorry for the blind people, and more about kind of different ways of inhabiting the environment. Pepele, so he's done a lot of this work, and like all social practice artists, it's documented in gallery shows and so on, either in video or in photographs. And Pepele was bothered by this because it meant, he's in an exhibit where his work is being exhibited, but it's inaccessible to blind people, including the artist himself. So he teamed up with a sound artist named Kai Tillman for one exhibit where they created a sonic reproduction of one of these walks. And this is an image of it, which I don't know if it's very interesting, but basically the gallery had a corridor, and they mounted speakers that are sort of about head height, and they played audio of one of these walks, two of these walks sort of on a loop. And so the visitors could walk through this corridor and get a kind of kinesthetic, sonic experience of one of the Blindfield Shuttle walks. Okay. My final artist here is a sculptor named Aaron McPeak. He's originally from Northern Ireland, but lived in London for many years. He was a lighting designer for the theater and especially for the opera in London. He began to lose his sight in his late 30s and could no longer do that work. So he went to art school, and he had always kind of, he had an art practice. He did some painting and some photography, but he saw it more as a hobby. But then when he lost his sight, he decided to go to art school, and he took up work in cast bronze. When I interviewed him, I said, newly blind person pouring molten metal? And he just chuckled. Like most artists, he remains mysterious. Anyway, and he, the work that I'm featuring here is bronze casts that are gongs, okay? Someone brought him a gong from Tibet, and he was taken with it. And so he started making objects which were casts, and he worked in the Whitechapel foundry in London, which has been around for many centuries, that casts bells. So these are all in bell bronze. And they are meant not only to be touched, but also to, in fact, to require touch. They don't really work as works of art unless they are touched, and particularly as they are struck with the wooden mallets that he provides, so that they release their sound. Okay, so they are visual, they are tactile, and they are sonic, all simultaneously, and they all kind of reference the experience of loss, both the experience of lost sight, as in here, Once I Saw It All, where he makes a bronze gong of the familiar Snellen eye chart, where you have the letters in getting smaller and smaller. Once I saw it all, now I don't. But also, and maybe he makes casts of objects from his commemorating lost loved ones, people who have died, and his own lost childhood. So on the left, there's a piece called Eileen's Palette. His mother, named Eileen, was a painter, and this is a cast he made of her palette, which has the sort of squiggles of oil paint on it. The one on the right is called My Teddy Brownie, and it's a cast of his well-worn teddy bear. And so that, obviously he retains the forms of these objects, but there is loss in the fact that there is no longer the same tactile elements, or in the case of the artist palette, the olfactory element, that those things are lost. The teddy bear has the form of the original teddy bear, but of course when you touch it, it doesn't have the squishy fuzziness of a teddy bear. Okay. And the final piece I'm going to show you is a self-portrait, a sort of more traditional self-portrait. The Blind Narcissus invents his own mirror, going back to the idea of self-portraiture and mirrors. And this is just to explain, he made a photograph of his shadow and had someone cut it out and then mold a three-dimensional form that he did the cast from. So it's not the death mask form where you put the medium on your face. So the face is much more abstracted than that. And here the bronze is coated with a mirrored surface. So when the viewer is standing looking at it, you get a sort of funhouse mirror effect. Okay. Just briefly to say his work, obviously, when it's displayed, it causes challenges. It demands a sort of rethinking of museums' display practices because the gongs need to be touched and they need to be sounded in order to activate their meaning. But he hasn't yet figured out how to do this, because if you have 10 people striking gongs, it becomes a kind of cacophonous thing. And so they lose some of the kind of meditative, elegiac quality that he's going for. But he's persisting in his efforts to promote display practices that will honor his work. Okay. This is a close-up image, and I'm going to play you the gong just so you can hear, because these really are stunningly beautiful sounds. Let's see if we can get that going. Yeah, it worked before. No? Yep. Oh, there it is. Thank you. I don't know if you could hear that, but two things to note. One is that because they're suspended, the gongs, it's not only just the resonance of the gong, but also there's an oscillation of the sound, which adds something to it. And they, because of the quality of metal that they use, they have an extraordinarily long, sustained note. So they're interesting for that reason. Just to conclude, I'll say that I hope I've been able to present the works of these artists for the varieties of ways that they bring their blindness into their work. But in bringing the blindness, in showing the blindness in their work, they are commenting on, but also deviating from sort of the more stereotypical images of blindness of the past, that they are interested in claiming their space in visual culture. They are interested in promoting ideas of a realignment of the senses. They're interested in speaking of blindness as a part of community. And interested, did I say this? Interested in thinking about a realignment of senses. And in so doing, how does that change our understandings of aesthetic values and aesthetic appreciation of art? Thank you very much. I can take a few questions. I don't know if the timing. Natalie will. I've talked too much. Oh, here's a challenge. You know, when I teach, I tell my students that they have to abandon that practice that was drilled into them in second grade, that you have to raise your hand. You can, if you wish, raise your hand and Natalie can recognize you, or just speak up. No. Oh, we have to mic it. Okay. So you're going to have to indicate that you're. Okay.
Yeah, this is Lucas. Hi. Quick question. So, have you organized exhibitions of any of these contemporary artists, and also have you delved into historical artists who have passed, who also, in addition to some of the images we saw, who have brought their either their own blindness or other disabilities into their works of art?
In answer to the first question, I did participate. There was an exhibit at the Berkeley Art Museum in 2005 called Blind at the Museum. And I was part of that exhibit. And that had, it was primarily the blind photographers. So Wingwall, Weston, and Dugdale were in that show, along with some others. In terms of the sort of historic figures, I mean, there are a lot of artists who lose sight late in life. And some of them, I would say the majority of them, seek ways to adapt their practice so that the blindness doesn't show. Though in the history of art, it's still a known fact. So then you get into these, what are known as late style debates, where you know, people theorize about what it means for an artist to be late in life, that is to say, with a greater sense of mortality. I find some of those discussions incredibly ageist and ableist. Also, you know, in some instances, you know, it's not apparent that the artist necessarily knew that they were near the end of their life. I mean, you can get these debates about Mozart, you know, who was, after all, young, but he died young. So I don't really address those artists, or certainly in this talk, I was wanting to focus on contemporary artists, and in particular artists who really seem to be referencing the experience of or different experiences of blindness. So simulating the experience, commenting on sort of social aspects of the experience, and also moving towards a realignment to other sensory experience. So more so than maybe Monet, Degas, George O'Keeffe, those artists.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask if, because I don't know, I wanted to ask if you might be able to tell us anything about how these artists that you're talking about themselves sort of position themselves as making art not primarily for a kind of sighted appreciation.
Well, I think a lot of them actually are making art that's meant for a sighted audience. Though some of them sort of shift, and start. I mean, for instance, the example of Carmen Pepele is that he was doing all the social practice art, and he realized, it sort of came to him one day. He says, they were talking about putting up photographs in a gallery, and he said, well, what good is that to me? I don't, and people could describe the photographs, but he's like, well, could we do something else? And so then he collaborated with this sound artist. I mean, a related question, and it's a kind of vexed question, is that some of these artists are not thoroughly happy with being identified as a blind artist or a disabled artist, that they worry about being ghettoized and sort of not taken as seriously. On the other side, there are artists who don't necessarily want to be associated with other blind artists because they're accustomed to thinking of themselves as singular and getting a certain amount of attention for being the one and only. Sarge Eman he was kind of wry about it. He said, I'm the only blind painter. I can't remember the small town that he lives in. I'm the one and only blind painter in small town Britain. But he generally was not, didn't show up in exhibits featuring other blind artists. But he's kind of unique. I mean, of these artists, he was sort of the most successful in the sense that he was represented by a very, very fancy London gallery. He was collected by many famous people, including Daniel Day-Lewis and Bruce Springsteen. Now, I don't know if being collected by Bruce Springsteen is like a measure of quality, but it's always cited as, he was very successful, and Bruce Springsteen, So there's that. And, there are also pressures for a lot of disabled artists from their dealers, their galleries, not to, identify in certain ways that might be seen to diminish the sense of quality and therefore value of their work. So it's very complicated. There's no one answer. And also, some of these artists, I know all of these, except for Sarge Eman, I know these artists, I've interviewed them. And over time, I've observed their attitudes about that question changing. So it's not a singular viewpoint.
Hi, Jess Lopez. I had a question on a lot of the images you presented seem to enlarge the spectrum of art, and I was wondering how that speaks to potentially the redefinition of a traditionally held concept of that space.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that interests me quite a bit. I mean, the reason that I concluded with Aaron McPeak was I think that he's quite a challenging artist to exhibit, because he does these gongs, he does other types of things in bronze. He does these, what he calls singing bowls, which are bronze bowls of various sizes, and you can hit them and they make different notes and so on and so forth. But the point is that they have to be touched and they have to be sounded. Otherwise they don't work. Otherwise they're just sort of interesting artifacts, visual artifacts. But his point is that they need the other senses in order to convey their meaning. And it has presented problems for him in terms of exhibition. Another artist I didn't talk about today, an Australian artist named Fayan Devi, that's D''EVIE, does a lot of different projects, but I was talking to somebody earlier, she does collage work, paper on paper, that she calls tactile paintings. And she's exhibited this work with big signs saying, touch the work. And she's interested in what's going to happen to this work over time. That as people touch it, it's going to have an effect. And she wants that. She wants to sort of measure how the appearance will change and how the texture will change. So there are big signs saying, touch the art. It's okay to touch the art. Please touch the art. Here, touch this. And for the most part, people don't. And she asked somebody, a visitor, sort of standing, she said, I'm the artist, I give you permission, go ahead, touch. And he looked around and he said, well, maybe I'll come back later when there aren't so many people around. And so it sort of speaks to both this how instilled it is in us all not to touch the art, don't touch the art, but also this sort of idea that, oh, I'm going to do it wrong, I don't want people watching me. It's the notion of intimacy, and all of that is interesting to this artist. Another set of work that she did is in bronze. It's cast bronze. What she does is she shakes hands with people, and she makes a cast of the negative space between the two hands, and then she bronzes that. And they're quite interesting little objects, and they're fun to handle. Bronze, as you may know, is very receptive to the heat of your skin. It warms up. It emits a telltale smell, sort of, metallic smell. Anyway, but to exhibit this work, they had real problems because if you put it on a traditional museum plinth, I mean, they're tiny, they're small, and they would be dwarfed by a plinth. And then there's the fear that if you're letting people pick them up and handle them, they're just going to put them in their pockets and walk away because they are fun. So she and a collaborator designed this display method where they had them all on pulleys, and they were enveloped in a sort of very soft, fine leather, like the leather they use in interiors of fine handbags. They made these sort of hammocks. And so the viewer would sort of pull the pulley down to your favorite viewing height, handling height, and then it sort of opened up, and you could, and this had the quality of it's sort of a performance of handling, right? And it made it somehow precious that these things sort of open up, and then you almost ritualistically reach in and feel them and compare them and so on, and then they go back up out of view. So the ultimate, I think, goal of a lot of these artists is to challenge museum practices and to try to bring new exhibit technologies and exhibit techniques into museum spaces.
Georgina, Mike Hudson from the Resource Center for Persons with Disabilities. Welcome to campus. Thanks for being here and sharing your observations. All too often, museums have become kind of you had the title Blind Rage, but blind people oftentimes feel disconnected, or sometimes blind rage surfaces about museums because the first thing we hear is do not touch. And then sometimes you even find out the exhibit after the display was just going to be destroyed anyways, and it really could have been touched.
Yeah.
So with the idea that we're at a flagship museum here that's working diligently to be more inclusive, do you have a best practice or two that we should be thinking about here, and or do you have a best practice museum we should try to emulate to really welcome blind people, and in fact for young people redefine that museum is not a place of exclusion, but it's a place of opportunity and a place to dream?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think the idea of best practice, in my work with museums, I've tried to promote it, because that's what they always ask me, well, what's the best way to do this? And I say, I don't know. And I think it has to, in some sense, I mean, there are best practices. You can find guidelines that give you sort of best practices and sort of tell you what other museums have done. But I think really in addition to that, or sort of above and beyond that, it has to be context-based. That it really has to take into account the context of the particular work, the particular exhibit, the particular artist, so that it's going to look and sound and feel different from different exhibits, from one show to the next. The trouble, though, is that how do you move those practices forward, and so that you don't have something that's really wonderfully accessible and interesting and engaging to everybody, not just the blind people, but everybody gets something out of it. And then that show goes down, and then you're back to business as usual. How do you move the thing forward? And one of the things that I've been trying to do, and what I started with, is this idea that access needs to be understood as a two-way process. And so that was why I bring the blind artists into the conversation, because I think if you want to sort of understand how do blind people conceptualize visual experience, talk to a blind person, and in particular talk to a blind artist, somebody who has a lifetime of experience of sort of making mental images and then turning them into objects or images that others can use. So I think that's something that needs to happen. I just recently worked on a project in San Francisco at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. I'm a big, I like tactile art. I like touch tours at museums. Over my lifetime, anytime somebody gives me the opportunity to get my hands on art, I, leap at the chance. But when I do that, I often feel, I go home, and they vary in quality, and sometimes it's more rewarding than other times. And when I go home, I feel like, I had an experience. I wish I could communicate that in some way, because I think other people, because whenever I say, I was touching this Brancusi the other day, and people say, ooh, what was that like? So what they did at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, they had an exhibit and that was commissioned of contemporary artists illustrating, it's sort of similar here, traditional Jewish folk tales. So each piece was sort of inspired by a folk tale. And so they brought me in to work with the 6 sculptural pieces. Some of them were paintings, some of them were photographs, so on and so forth. And they let me get my hands on this work. And then they recorded me, sharing my observations. So in effect, I was conducting a touch tour for sighted people. And you can find this, if you go to their website, they have it all up. They have video and audio and so on and so forth. But, the work is only partially done. I mean, the next thing is like, okay, so when this show ends, how are you going to carry on another occasion where a blind person brings a particular expertise to share about visual art. So I think it's an ongoing process. And sometimes I think that the whole notion of best practices kind of is a barrier to innovation, because it sort of becomes the ground level of, okay, well, this is what they do at the Metropolitan. So that's a big fancy museum. So if we do that, that'll be fine. But maybe not. So it requires imagination and ingenuity and so on and so forth. Yeah. Are we done?
And maybe this is a good moment to segue. I'll try to use my projection skills. But this is a moment for, I think, to take that as inspiration to go and touch the artworks. Because we have a short break between this talk and the next. And so I would like to invite all of you to actually do that. We only have the ones currently up, right, on the wall display side on the right. But there are programs in Braille, there are audio descriptions, there are all sorts of things. And as we are possibly moving through this, I think reflecting on this, especially as in terms of the idea of it being a two-way, right, exchange about the multisensory inspiration that the artists drew on when creating these works, and on how we can actually use, I think, student-generated creativity as an inspiration, I hope, right, to develop whole new, whatever kind of practices, good practices, decent practices, good for that moment practices, good for this space practices, right, that we can actually move ahead with and use that flexibility to move forward, hopefully. And with that, a round of applause.